जाओ साहब, बॉम्बे का सेटिंग होने वाला, अमेरिका को पैसा चाहिए इधर आओ, जापान को पैसा चाहिए इधर आओ, बॉम्बे का सेटिंग होने वाला.
So Gyan, I'd like to start off with an extremely basic question, but a necessary question, which is when there are so many Bombay books around, there have been a lot of Bombay books around, and there were a few Bombay books, in fact, which were released along with your Bombay book. Why did you decide on Mumbai Fables? Bombay is a city that has been exploited, plundered, and explained and understood in so many different ways. What made you decide, okay, I'm going to go in there and say something which hasn't been said about this city?
Well, it's true that a number of books have been written, and I'm often asked what I call the S&M question after Suketu Mehta's Maximum City. Why did you feel the need to write it? Most of those books are by journalists, and they write about the contemporary city, which is what they do. And I wanted to step back and ask, how did we get there? So we understand what the city is like from all these kind of journalistic accounts. But I'm a historian, and so I dig. And so I wanted to dig underneath and, in a way, kind of explain how the journalists could tell the kind of stories that they do tell. So that's how I ended up writing Mumbai Fables.
Right. Since you're talking about history, Gyan, there is a very important question, which is that Bombay is often called the city of no memory. It's called the city of zero memory because it's a city where, well, no restaurant stays. Bandra is a place where they say one restaurant opens every month and one restaurant shuts down every month. Even all over the city, things just keep changing. Bombay changes so fast. In a city which is called a city of no memory, where do you find the significance of history? Where do you find that connect between from where you started out, where Bombay was concerned, and where it is today?
Well, way back actually in the early 20th century, Dinshaw Wacha wrote a book in which he says Bombay is a parvenu city. There's nothing new, old here. Unlike any other cities, it doesn't have some ancient temples or monuments and so on. Everything changes. And so I was always kind of aware and impressed by that everything in Bombay is so plastic. It can change. And I wanted to understand not so much what endures, but what explains a city like that. Because its character is very different from, let's say, Delhi, where you can go back to old memories of, the Tughlaqabad and then, Shahjahanabad and so on. In Delhi, where there's no, in Bombay, where there's no such thing, how do you make sense of a city that is changing, within minutes, and what explains it? So that's why I sort of went back and to the Portuguese period and trace how it changes so rapidly. And of course, the pace of change is quickened in the more recent time. So for me, history is not so much an issue of something that really endures, but what explains, in a way, what we have today.
How many layers of explanation, how layered was that explanation? How many layers of explanation did you have to go through? Because if you're talking about history as something that explains, and you're talking about going that far, and you're talking about a city which today is called the city that changes every moment, then there must have been many layers to say, okay, this happened, so this happened, so this happened, so this happened. So were there a lot of layers, or are there certain places where you found, or certain places where you found primary points of connect between what happened there and what's persisting till today?
Well, I mean, I can give you one example. Take the more recent Adarsh housing scam, and where you see the connection between, builders and bureaucrats and politicians and so on. And in the book, for example, I speak about Marine Drive and how it came to be, which came out of a scam in the 1920s. And then in the 1970s, when Nariman Point gets built.
There was a very interesting reference where Nariman Point is concerned about the Red Deer building.
And there's another scam. And not only a scam, I mean, the irony of building something and call it Nariman Point, who was the original muckraker in the 1920s. I mean, the irony was just amazing. So when the other scam happened, I mean, my reaction was, this is a continuing pattern in Bombay. It is connected to of course, space shortage in Bombay, but it's also connected to the way in which every time the scam happens, there's always a kind of a fictional cover for it.
Right.
So earlier it was, we need to reclaim lands in order to relieve space shortage in the city, for the poor and so on. But actually, of course, it was not for the poor. In the 70s, again, there was a similar kind of a fictional cover. And this time it was for Kargil widows and, veterans. So, and this is what kind of, sort of impressed me in this, in Bombay, that, you always have a certain fable or fiction or myth around which certain things happen, and then behind it there is another story. So you're talking about layers, so you have to take both the fictional layer, which in a way is also important, because people who are doing it, I mean, they are living by it, they are selling it, and then there is another layer where people are sitting behind closed doors and deciding what to do.
In fact, I'm very glad you chose that example, because your book is one thing I'm very happy about when it comes to your book is the way it looks at housing, something which possibly hasn't been stressed. I mean, people keep talking about it, but when you're looking at the history of Bombay, the fact that it looks at housing and the builders' lobby, something that people sort of look over. People talk about the stock markets, the film industry, a lot of things, but the builders' lobby and the way it has sort of controlled Bombay's history. So when it comes to the builders' lobby, what do you feel about the influence they exert today?
The influence is enormous. It seems like everything that happens in Bombay, there is some builder behind it. Any schemes. I mean, for example,
I mean, a place where you wouldn't expect to find a builder, but you find a builder right there.
For the whole slum rehabilitation scheme, which is, in fact, really a real estate swindle. I mean, here are people, take Dharavi, where you have all these migrants who came from South India, from UP, from various other places.
West Bengal,
They came and made a swamp habitable. They did the initial work.
They made it profitable.
They made it profitable. And then suddenly you have the government, urban planners, builders come in and say, oh, this is too valuable a land to be occupied by slums. It's right next to Bandra Kurla complex, so we should have, slum rehabilitation scheme, which of course would lead to kind of commercialization of land, and eventually, the poor would be pushed out. So again and again, housing is used as a ruse for various kinds of, real estate scams.
In fact, here, since you brought up Dharavi, I would ask you to take stands on a couple of things. One thing I really would like to know your stand on is on Dharavi and the slum rehabilitation there. I mean, in fact, Dharavi is actually a place few people know about. People think of it as a slum, but even the area-wise profitability, even the income tax, I think amounts to 7,000 or 8,000 crores just from that slum. But what is your stand where the slum rehabilitation of Dharavi that is happening today, even as we speak, is concerned?
Well, I mean, there's no doubt that the conditions in Dharavi are really awful, and the conditions are awful because the state has provided no infrastructure facilities, municipal facilities, and so I think what planners and bureaucrats should do is to look at what people have actually done and learn from the urban planning on the ground.
The residents on the ground and the ad hoc urban planning carry on,
Because, that reflects their desires, how they live their lives. For example, the connection between work and life. You can see that, in this, in the neighborhood. So rather than urban planners coming and saying, oh, this place is, terrible, and we should just demolish it and have slum rehabilitation, you should actually learn from the ground up and provide facilities. I'm not saying that, I don't want to romanticize.
And say they'll do everything.
Or that, what exists is good. No, what exists is not good because, under terrible conditions they have done this. So you should provide them facilities. You should provide, for example, credit facilities so people can run their businesses. You should provide education. You should provide all the infrastructure facilities that they should have. What you shouldn't do is to come and say, well, we will rehabilitate them in these towers, because what happens really is each family will get 200 square feet or something, and then over a period of time, they will sell those to others, and these will be converted into 3-bedroom, 4-bedroom flats.
And I feel that the worst thing about the government's approach is that they're treating Dharavi as a residential area, which is complete rubbish because it's actually a place of work, which in Bombay is extremely important because Bombay is the city of work. And while it's okay to build houses and put people in there, even if they do that, as they say they are doing, what about the work that these people are doing? And what you said rightly, especially the point about loans, about getting credit. These people don't have credit. All their businesses, these businesses that generate so much of revenue, that feed so many industries throughout Bombay and India, are all actually illegitimate businesses. So don't you think that those businesses, there should be a step towards looking at the legitimizing of those businesses, giving them proper credit so that they don't have to rely on underworld loan sharks?
I mean, I say in the book that, Dharavi is pure free enterprise.
Exactly. Absolute. That's laissez-faire for you, right?
It's, and it's pure Mumbai.
Right.
Where, people have created something out of nothing.
Right. I remember,
It's their dynamism that makes Dharavi Dharavi. And, one's normal image of a slum is a place of squalor and depression and so on. Dharavi is alive. There's the energy is kind of pulsating on the street. And so what you should do is actually, run with it, flow with it, and then, provide them with credit facilities and other kind of infrastructure facilities that enables them to run their businesses, better and get better returns, and wages get better and so on. If you think of it as a blight that has to be removed, you will kill the dynamism that makes Dharavi Dharavi.
Right, and which contributes to Bombay as well, in a huge way. Gyan, one thing here, which is the points that you've raised out here, these are very significant points. They have been spoken about also by Kalpana Sharma in her book Rediscovering Dharavi. They are points that are being raised by a lot of activists throughout Bombay, local Bombay activists who are screaming and saying that this is the way to do it. How does one get to the government? I'm asking you because you come from a certain position, let's say you come from a place where you can go, let's say speak to somebody, but how, is it possible to get through to the government on these things? Or are these things that we write about, we put out there, the public read it, but how does one take this to effecting change?
I mean, it really depends on, very sustained urban activism. And, there are activists in Bombay who are concerned about this issue and, they agitate over it. But, the unfortunate thing is that, they can raise they can raise hell. But ultimately, when the government decides, these people are shunted out. I mean, you could take a good example. This was about the mill lands, and there was a Korea committee, and the Korea committee came up with this sort of one-third formula. But in its implementation, it was completely undone by the government because the government is, so much under the influence of builders, and they've bought into this sort of a new liberal ideal of, corporatization is the answer to everything.
Do you see any hope there? Because you've gone in there and spoken to a lot of people. Do you see any ray of light, any way in which possibly change could be made? I mean, activism is going on. Continued activism is going on. Is there any way in which you would like the activism to be better? Is there any, have you thought that maybe this could work?
I think the only, the problem with, often with activism is that at a certain point, it loses steam. And there is no other answer. It just has to be relentless, and there has to be better coordination among various different urban activists. But if without a political pressure and political change of that sort, nothing else works. I mean, even if you think of some, let's say, influential urban planners and architects and so on who have the ear of the government and that they will solve it. That is another recipe for disaster because, New Bombay, for example, happened that way.
Mumbai,
and, it didn't resolve any problem. It just became a bedroom community. So really the only answer is, I mean, unfortunately, very sustained and, unrelenting activism.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you spoke about the milllands, and I want to come to that. But before that, there are a few other things that I would like to know your stance on. The first of them, very predictably, being the Shiv Sena, and now the Shiv Sena's prodigy, which is Raj Thackeray and his MNS, their stand on migrants, their stand on reservation for Maharashtrians. What is your stand on that? What do you feel about that?
Well, I mean, if the Shiv Sena and MNS had their way,
Right.
Bombay wouldn't be Bombay.
Right.
And it gives me some comfort that they haven't succeeded entirely.
Right. Despite all the shouting and beating up.
All the
and
shouting,
killing, yeah.
because Bombay owes its dynamism to its status as a migrant city.
Right.
And although Maharashtrians may be 40% of the population, but even those Maharashtrians, many of them are migrants themselves from
Right,
Maharashtra.
right.
So the historic sort of status and experience of Bombay is that it is a city that is dynamic, that is energetic, because migrants come and make something out of nothing.
Right.
So obviously, I think the disconcerting thing is that the government, even the Congress, is unwilling, afraid, or maybe complicit with this anti-immigrant rhetoric. I mean, the recent example was when Rohinton Mistri's book was withdrawn from the university curriculum. The government just folded. The Vice Chancellor just folded. So, I mean, they have to be, brought to account and say, no, there are certain fundamental rights of citizens involved here.
Right.
So,
Right. What do you feel the coolies, the fishermen in Bombay, the coastal fishermen, who are called the actual original inhabitants of Bombay, as a historian, what do you feel they think about this? What have you?
well, I mean, coolies are, divided. Many of them are, supporters of.
Right. I can expect them to be.
Yeah.
Are there some other voices from in there as well?
Yeah, I mean, there are,
farms,
because there are coolies and there are people who see themselves as original inhabitants of Bombay. For example, people who are defined as East Indian Christians, who are different from Goan Christians, and they were kind of original inhabitants of the land and then converted to Christianity. They don't want any truck with this Shiv Sena kind of nativism.
Sons of the soil thing.
Yeah, because they believe that Bombay actually grew and became what it is by being open, by drawing in people from Gujarat, from UP, from all over India and beyond. So the trouble is that, of course, the Shiv Sena voice, because it's a very militant party, and MNS now, trying to even be more militant than Shiv Sena, that it intimidates the others, and the opposition is never organized enough to mount a kind of challenge to Sena.
Right. Drawing on a history of about 30 years back, let me ask you a political question, which is, if Bala Saheb Thackeray passes away, as every human being does have to pass away, then where do you think the future of Maharashtra politics will go? Do you think the Shiv Sena and MNS will merge into one, and there will be this now divided voice for now divisive regional voice will become a very strong regional voice, and which will threaten Mumbai's cosmopolitan fabric in that sense?
What is really characteristic about both the Senas is that they represent a certain kind of politics, which I call in the book populism. And normally when people say populism, you kind of dismiss it, that it's not proper politics. But actually it is a very significant political movement, which is also based on the idea of the leader. That populist movement without the leader,
the figurehead,
will fritter away. And Shiv Sena today is not what it used to be when Bal Thackeray was in full flow.
Full flow,
So let's say if the two come together as a populist movement, and let's say Raj Thackeray emerges as the new leader, it will be, a very powerful force in Bombay. But I think the trend in Bombay's politics is away from that kind of supremacy of populism. It will be a significant force, but I don't see it becoming a dominant force. Someone that will exercise its influence over, the entire
Maharashtra
city.
politics, and therefore the politics of the city as well.
Yeah. So I don't see that happening, as a kind of a dominant force. But it will always remain, now as a kind of a shadow.
Right.
And as a kind of intimidating shadow, because even people who do not agree with the Sena are afraid to speak out.
Right.
Because Sena's politics is based on a politics of violence and intimidation. I mean, that is characteristic of its populism.
Right.